Welcome back to the Death Row and Executions channel. So the difference between this video and the previous upcoming videos I've done here is that this guy is saying he didn't do it. As a matter of fact, he's saying he wasn't even there. This has also become a very high-profile case, mostly because of celebrities and professional athletes that have come to the defense of the man convicted and soon to be executed. People like Kim Kardashian and Academy Award-winning actress Viola Davis, NBA stars Blake Griffin and Russell Westbrook, NFL quarterback Baker Mayfield. Combined, these celebrities have several 100 million followers on social media. And they're telling their followers that not only should the man convicted not be executed, that he should go free because it was a wrongful conviction. And it's not just these celebrities saying this. Mass news media outlets have also jumped on board this campaign. We're talking about this man right here. His name is Julius Jones. He is currently on death row in the state of Oklahoma and is scheduled to be put to death by lethal injection this coming November 18th for murder that occurred 21 years ago on July 28th, 1999. Because of all the media attention coming to the aid of Julius Jones, the Attorney General of Oklahoma, Mike Hammer, recently provided a document to the public called Overwhelming Evidence of Guilt. And I have a copy of it right here, in which he explains how Julius Jones did in fact commit this murder. Attorney General Hammer provides details from court transcripts from the trial and various hearings. I'm going to be going over some of this with you today, and I will also discuss how Jones's defense team over the years have challenged this evidence. Jones's current defense team, led by some lawyers out of Arizona named Amanda Bass and Dale Bache, recently brought up some of those challenges in a clemency hearing for Julius Jones before the Pardon and Parole Board. Julius Jones was also allowed to speak, though he read the material from papers he was holding, and there is talk of how most of it was probably written by his lawyers. The panel ultimately voted to recommend that Governor Kevin Stitt commute Jones's sentence to a life sentence. What that means is that at this point in time, the only one who can stop the execution of Julius Jones is the governor, Governor Kevin Stitt. Julius Jones had just turned 19 years old 3 days before this murder happened. His birthday was July 25th. It would appear from everything I've seen that Julius comes from a very loving, decent family. His father was a hard worker in construction. He took good care of his family, and they all attended church regularly as Julius was growing up. Beginning at age 15, Julius did get into some legal troubles with some misdemeanor charges. But aside from that, he was considered an outstanding student at John Marshall High School in Oklahoma, achieving amazing grades and he had an excellent GPA. He was also a very talented athlete there and earned a scholarship to Oklahoma University. Soon after he began college, however, Julius Jones's behavior and conduct changed drastically. He began associating with the wrong people and committing violent crimes, as later proven during the murder trial that got him put on death row. Julius Jones did so poorly in his first semester at college. His GPA was a horrible 0.8. And he missed so much time attending classes that his scholarship was revoked and he no longer qualified for financial aid. So he never got a chance to play sports at Oklahoma University. In a document created by Oklahoma District Attorney David Prater, he documents a long list of crimes committed by Jones beginning in the fall of 1998, soon after Jones had turned 18 years old. Now, I'm not going to go over all of them. Instead, I'll just go ahead and skip ahead to the month of the murder that he was convicted for. That month of July, 19 days before the murder, Jones committed armed robbery in a mall's jewelry store by placing a gun to the store owner's head. Jones had a stocking over his head, a bandana over his face, and he wore gloves. A couple weeks later, on July 21st, Jones carjacked a Lexus by pressing a gun to the owner's head. Jones had a bandana over his face, and he was wearing gloves. Julius Jones later sold that car for $4,000. On the next day, July 22nd, Jones carjacked a Mercedes-Benz by pointing a gun at the owner, who had just exited a restaurant. That car was eventually recovered from a parking lot where Jones was renting an apartment. There was a temporary paper license plate on the back, and a handwriting expert later confirmed that the numbers on the plate were written by Julius Jones. The keys to that car were eventually found in a Cutlass Supreme that Julius Jones shared with a friend named Chris Jordan. They both used this car. Julius Jones would also eventually plead guilty to carjacking that Mercedes, but now states that his lawyer had forced him to do so and he hadn't committed that crime, regardless of the evidence. 6 days later, on July 28th, 1999, according to documentation established by District Attorney David Prater, a witness named Eki Prater, no known relation to the district attorney, was able to recognize Julius Jones's friend, Chris Jordan, driving that Cutlass Supreme into the driveway of a home where there are usually two Suburbans parked. Chris Jordan would later testify in court that he and Julius Jones were driving around that afternoon specifically looking for Suburbans because they were easier to sell. Eki Prater said that while he was able to identify Chris Jordan as the driver, he couldn't identify the passenger, but that it was a black male in his late teens to early 20s with hair cut close to his head. Now, I haven't seen this segment of testimony from Eki Prater in the court transcript, but what the district attorney David Prater is describing seems to conflict with what the defense attorney David McKenzie, who represented Julius Jones, stated in an interview for a recent podcast created by a Shelley Levisay. In that interview, McKenzie states that the witness, Eki Prater, had testified that the individual seen next to Jordan more closely fits a man named Liddell King, who is much older, in his 30s, and is a much bigger and heavier, robust-looking man. I will be bringing up more on Liddell King a bit later. As it turns out, the owners of the Suburbans were not home. They were on vacation as Chris Jordan and his passenger pulled out of the driveway and left. Chris Jordan would later testify that he and Julius Jones then decided it would be best to wait until it's dark out to get their hands on a Suburban. Remember, Julius Jones continues to deny to this day that he was that passenger. Later that day, a resident of Edmond, Oklahoma, named Paul Howell, along with his sister Megan and Paul's 2 young daughters, ages 7 and 9, went back to school supply shopping at a Target store. After they were done shopping, on their way home, they entered the drive-thru of a Brown's ice cream place for some ice cream. A man named Michael Peterson and his wife later testified at trial that while they were seated outside Brown's having ice cream, they watched as a Cutlass Supreme suspiciously circled the Brown's parking lot several times and then backed into a parking space. They described the occupants as 2 young black men, both appearing in their early 20s, and that the driver had cornrows in his hair, and the passenger was wearing a white T-shirt. Chris Jordan testified that he and Julius Jones had been following the Suburban driven by Paul Howell, and it was them in the Brown's parking lot. Julius Jones maintains that is a lie. Paul Howell, with his sister Megan beside him and the girls in the back seat, then drove the 3.3 miles back to his parents' home in Edmond, where he was living following his divorce. Once parked in the driveway, a man approached the car. One of the girls, the one sitting right behind her father in the back seat, would later say that she waved hello at the man who she could see through the window. It was 9:31 p.m. that evening as Paul Howell stepped out of the car. The man that had approached the car placed a gun to his head and shot. His sister Megan panicked and immediately gave priority to the safety of the 2 girls in the back. She pulled the children from the vehicle, and all 3 made a run for the house's front door. As she was getting the children out of the car, she had heard the man yell, "Where are the keys?" Then, as they were running toward the house, she heard the man again yell, "Stop!" And immediately afterward, she heard a second shot that she believes was fired in her direction. That second bullet, however, was later determined to have entered the vehicle's dashboard and was later found below in the floorboard. The Suburban was then driven away by the shooter, rolling the vehicle over Paul Howell's legs as it left the driveway.
My son's been shot out in the front yard.
You know,
He's got no pulse.
where was he shot at?
I don't know. I was in bed. The kids came running in. He's laying out in the driveway.
Okay, do you know who did it, sir?
No, he just drove up with his kids and they shot him.
Who did?
His car. I don't know.
Okay.
Get an ambulance.
Okay, I've already got help on the way, sir, okay?
When police arrived, Paul Howell's sister, Megan Tobey, who is now the only adult witness to have seen the shooter, gave a description of the man. Now, we don't know exactly what she told the police because that was not recorded except for the officer's written report. No body cams at that time. We can only go by what she said she had told the police. That is on record. And the description that she gave from court transcripts and interviews when she was spoken to. And it is important to note, aside from the many different versions of that description reported by others over the years, that Megan Tobey has never changed her version of what the shooter looked like. Megan Tobey said it was a young black male wearing a white t-shirt. He had a red bandana over his face, and he was wearing a stocking cap on his head, and that there was about a half inch to an inch of hair sticking out from under the cap. Now, much has been made about Megan's use of the term sticking out. Those in defense of Julius Jones say that his hair was a buzz cut short haircut. He had almost no hair. That he did not have hair long enough to hang down an inch or a half inch from a stocking cap. They instead want to push the blame to Chris Jordan as the shooter, saying he had cornrows and they could have easily been sticking out from under a stocking cap. But when you analyze exactly what Megan Tobey has said in court and in interviews, what she has said from day one and continues to say today, is that she was not speaking about the length of the hair when she said sticking out. What Megan Tobey, after analyzing this, is clear, is obviously describing, and her description has never changed, is a reference to the amount of hair showing under the stocking cap. Maybe using the words sticking out would be better interpreted as showing or exposed. And if the shooter was wearing a stocking cap not pulled all the way down over his ears, some hair is going to show unless you are completely bald. When asked at trial if the shooter had cornrows, she said she saw no cornrows. It appeared she thought of cornrows as braids, and that she was more familiar with that term. It would seem that if the shooter had braids or cornrows, she would have provided that in the description she gave police and would have said that in court. He had cornrows. But she didn't.
His stocking cap was so tight on his head, I know I would have seen the cornrows underneath because the top of his hat was smooth.
Now, Chris Jordan, he had cornrows. And in a recent interview, Megan Tobey said that the stocking cap the shooter wore was worn smoothly over his head. If the shooter had been Chris Jordan, or if the shooter had cornrows, there would have been bumps in that stocking cap, and that she clearly saw no bumps. It lay smoothly and evenly across the top of his rounded head. A man by the name of Liddell King, who also had serious legal troubles at the time, would later testify in court that at about 10 p.m. that night, About a half hour after the shooting, Chris Jordan arrived in the Cutlass Supreme at his home. He said that about 15 minutes later, Julius Jones arrived in Paul Howell's Suburban. He said that Julius Jones was wearing a white t-shirt and there was a red bandana hanging around his neck. King said that Julius Jones was also wearing thick gloves, even though it was a hot summer night. King said Jones told him, "Don't touch the Suburban," likely a reference to not get his fingerprints on it, and that Jordan and Jones asked him to help them sell this car. Liddell King's girlfriend, Vixen McDonald, testified that she was also at King's home that night and confirmed that Chris Jordan and Julius Jones were there with the Suburban and the Cutlass. Also, a neighbor of Liddell King's named Gordon Owens testified that he was outside his house and saw Julius Jones speaking with King near Mr. Howell's Suburban that night, sometime after 10 p.m. To this day, Julius Jones is saying that Liddell King is lying, that his girlfriend Vixen McDonald is lying, and the neighbor Gordon Owens, the neighbor, is lying, that he was not there that night, and all of them lied under oath in court during the trial. Chris Jordan testified that after leaving King's home, Julius Jones told him about the killing, that he had hid behind a tree and then walked up to the car, and the little girl in the back seat waved at him. He said that after Paul Howell opened the car door, the gun went off by accident. This is what Chris Jordan told the court Julius Jones had told him that night. Liddell King testified that on the following day, Thursday, July 29, he and Jones spoke on the phone about selling the Suburban. Julius was now at home. Now, this is the moment that Julius Jones says he first became involved in this whole situation, when King called him the day after the murder. King says he went in his Firebird to pick up Julius Jones at Julius's home, where he was living with his family. They went back to King's home, where the Suburban was still parked, and Julius Jones got into the driver's seat. They first stopped at a convenience store for snacks. This is seen on video surveillance from the store's cameras. They left the Suburban at the convenience store, and both men got into the Firebird. They then went to see a man named Kermit Lottie, who operated a chop shop, auto shop, a few blocks away from the convenience store. Liddell King already knew that Kermit Lottie does not want anyone driving stolen vehicles into his shop, and that's why it was left behind. Kermit Lottie, who also had some pending legal issues of his own, testified that when the Suburban was described to him at his auto shop, he told King and Julius Jones that a man was killed last night, and that sounds exactly like the car the man was driving, that it was all over the news, and he will have no part of it. He's not interested in the Suburban. Liddell King testified that later that night, Julius Jones admitted to him that he had killed Paul Howell. that a little girl in the back seat waved at him, and the gun went off as Paul Howell got out of his car. On Friday morning, the following morning, police discovered Paul Howell's Suburban abandoned at that convenience store. They then canvassed the area and caught a break when they entered Kermit Lottie's auto shop. And Lottie, who was already known as an informant for the police anyway, came forward and told police that, Liddell King and another man later known to be Julius Jones tried to sell him that vehicle. So police later arrested Liddell King, who later informed detectives everything he knew and was told by Chris Jordan and Julius Jones. So he was spilling everything out at this point as well. Police arrived at Julius Jones's house, but they didn't go inside. They instead called the phone number that Liddell King had given them. Now, it's not clear from all the reports who answered the phone, but soon after police attempted making those calls, Julius Jones fled from a second-floor window in the rear of the house, and he was gone. By the time police decided to enter the home, he wasn't there. His family were all directed to go outside as the house was searched for Julius. Soon after, police spotted Christopher Jordan at a payphone and arrested him. And later that day, they got a lead on Julius Jones's location and arrested him as well. When Christopher Jordan was arrested at that payphone, he yelled at the cops, "I didn't do it. It was Julius." During a search of Julius Jones's house, investigators found a white T-shirt and a stocking cap on the floor of Julius's bedroom. Now, that T-shirt was tested for blood and none was found. However, the medical examiner stated that the gun that killed Paul Howell was pressed firmly against his head and that would have prevented blood spatter. Those investigators searching the house then found, hidden in the attic, a gun wrapped in a red bandana. Ballistics proved the gun to have been the one used to kill Paul Howell. Now, Julius Jones's defense is that Chris Jordan hid the gun up there. That Jordan had slept in his room one night, and this is all part of a huge, elaborate frame-up job created by Chris Jordan and Liddell King. One might ask, however, if Jordan was intent on framing Julius, why go through the trouble of having the gun so well hidden? Why not place it in a drawer or under the bed? Now, jumping ahead to the future for a moment, to the year 2017, 18 years later, Julius Jones's defense team, and I believe the Innocent Project was also involved, began insisting that the state of Oklahoma have that red bandana tested for DNA. Now that DNA science was a lot more accurate than it was in 1999. However, the results would come back to haunt them. From my understanding, the Innocence Project dropped out of the case after they got those results. And the defense team had to begin damage control measures. The DNA lab chosen by the defense reported that there were 3 contributors of DNA on that bandana, and that Julius Jones was the major contributor. While most of the DNA was degraded, there was enough to confirm the major contributor as matching Julius Jones as 1 in 110 million African Americans in the United States to have placed that DNA there. The 2019 census shows there to be approximately 42 million blacks in the United States. So you would have to almost triple the current population in the United States to find a second person that would have matched. The other two contributors on that bandana were too degraded to compare to anyone. Julius Jones's defense claims they asked the lab if Chris Jordan could be excluded as one of those contributors, and the lab said no, Chris Jordan can't be excluded. So the defense is now saying that the lab told them that no, Chris Jordan can't be excluded as one of those other two contributors of DNA on the bandana. But this is just a fancy way for the defense of saying that nobody can be excluded. You can't be excluded. I can't be excluded. It's just more damage control on the part of the defense. Okay, so the defense also says that the investigators searching Julius Jones's house were touching things all around Julius's bedroom and then used the same hand or hands to grab onto that bandana in the attic. So that this is no proof that Julius Jones shot anyone. Okay, so before we go on with this, let's go over something. In the state of Oklahoma, as is the case in most states, if two or more individuals commit a crime together as accomplices, whether both were standing beside each other or one served as a lookout or as a getaway driver, or maybe one was in a different state or in a different country and planned a killing with someone else, with the killer, they are all charged with homicide and may all receive the same exact punishment, including the death penalty. It doesn't matter who was holding the gun. It doesn't matter who the shooter was. A lot of back and forth about this case has been about the identity of the shooter, whether or not Julius Jones had been the shooter or Chris Jordan was the shooter. The state's criminal justice system doesn't care. The only thing people need to decide with this case is not if Julius Jones was the shooter, but if he was there, if he was present. Focus on that. So after all the arrests were made, Liddell King cooperated with authorities and the investigation. Kermit Lottie cooperated. Chris Jordan not only cooperated with the investigation and confessed, he went ahead and pled guilty to murder. Soon after Julius Jones was arrested, he refused to cooperate with the investigation and immediately asked for a lawyer, which is his right and probably the smartest thing to do. However, he continued to deny that he was present when Paul Howell was killed and that everyone is lying about that night. Julius Jones and his defense team have complained over the years that people like Kermit Lottie, the chop shop owner, and Liddell King got a sweet deal from the state for their testimonies, that their legal troubles magically disappeared after that, even though the state vehemently refutes that they had anything to do with those charges. Julius Jones complains that Chris Jordan got a sweet deal for murder and only served 15 years in prison for the crime. In actuality, he was sentenced to life in prison with all but the first 30 years suspended, and with time served and good behavior in prison, he earned credits for an earlier release. To this day, he is on probation. He is not walking free, as many in the media have stated. The sentence was part of the agreement for testifying against Julius Jones. Prosecutors refute that they had anything to do with the early release, however, because they have no control over how the Department of Corrections calculates the early release program for inmates. Was it a sweet deal for Chris Jordan? Maybe it was. When Julius Jones continued to claim that he was not present when Paul Howell was killed, with the overwhelming mountain of evidence building against him, it would appear that had enraged the prosecutors for the state of Oklahoma, led by a man named Robert H. Macy, or Bob Macy. It would seem that their position at the time was, okay, you want to play that game? So instead of putting both you and your partner on trial, in this case, we're going to give Chris Jordan a plea deal for his testimony, and you will fry. In actuality, and I don't know how many of you might agree with this, had Julius Jones confessed, had his defense team argued that Julius Jones was still only 18 years old 4 days before the murder, that his brain wasn't yet fully matured yet, that he was a good kid from a good church-going, God-fearing family until just before he started college. And maybe even if he had stuck to the story that Chris Jordan said Julius had told him, that the gun went off by accident, this would all be an entirely different story. Julius Jones and Chris Jordan may have received similar sentences with no deal for Jordan. And quite possibly, it would not have been death sentences. Well, I'm not sure, because Julius Jones did have 3 felony convictions prior to the murder of Paul Howell, and Chris Jordan had none. That may have made a difference in the sentence. But Julius Jones continued to deny that he was present when Paul Howell was killed. He continues to say he was not there. And because of that, he's going to get himself executed. Julius Jones continued to deny that he was there with all this evidence mounting against him. And there will be a lot more evidence coming. As Julius Jones's attorneys, David McKenzie and Malcolm Savage, were preparing for trial, they got information from the Jones family that Julius was home on the evening of Wednesday, July 28th, when Paul Howell was killed. But there was a problem with that. Julius Jones had already told his attorneys that he was on the south side of Oklahoma City that night. Anyway, wanting to look into it further, the attorneys sent investigators to the Jones home, who came back saying, yeah, the Jones family insists that Julius Jones was home that night, that they were all there having a spaghetti dinner and then played Monopoly. and that a family friend named Brenda Cujo was also there and could confirm that. David Mackenzie and Malcolm Savage were thrilled. They were off the hook. Julius Jones must be mistaken about where he was. They spoke to Julius again, but Julius said no, his family is wrong. They're mistaken. He wasn't home that night. The defense team's investigators then went to see the family friend Brenda Cujo. And at first she said, yeah, we had that spaghetti dinner together and Julius was home all evening. So this was getting even better for the defense. Brenda Cujo then stated that that same day she had gone to a Kinko's, where people go to get items shipped or have documents copied, with Julius Jones's mom. And Brenda Cujo produced the receipt for that trip to the Kinko's store. However, the receipt showed the date as Tuesday, July 27th, the day before the murder. Oops! Julius Jones's attorneys could no longer ethically put the Jones family on the stand as an alibi, knowing they would be mistaken or flat out lying. To this day, however, the Jones family is sticking to their story that Julius was home the night Paul Howell was killed, and they are leaving Brenda Cujo out of it. Mr. Jones, Julius's father, has also stated that he learned of Paul Howell's murder from the news on TV that same night and that Julius was sitting next to him on the couch. But Julius Jones has remarked on several occasions that he hadn't learned of the murder until the following day. Julius Jones's girlfriend at the time, Annalise Presley, testified at trial that Julius Jones told her he was somewhere on the south side of Oklahoma City. So it appears that Julius, for a time, wanted to stick by that story that he was hanging out somewhere on the south side of Oklahoma City. Unlike many other videos on this case, I'm not going to put a whole lot of emphasis on other evidence showing the likelihood that the gun was most likely Julius's gun, since other bullets for that gun were found in his home, hiding in various places, and a cartridge were found in his house and in his car, a Buick Regal that Julius Jones owned and was in a repair shop. Or how the mechanic from that shop found bullets that fit the murder weapon and a stocking cap with a knot in the top of the stocking. Firstly, either Julius or Chris Jordan could have handled that gun at any time, since they were together often. And we already know from the record that Julius was involved in robberies using a gun and a stocking cap, making the whole situation mute, really. So the big question is, where was Julius Jones when Paul Howell was killed? If he truly was on the south side of Oklahoma City, who was he with? Because nobody has come forward saying Julius Jones was with that person on that night. Was he home? The night after Brenda Cujo was there, of course. Then why did he insist he wasn't? And is only now, in recent years, agreeing with his family. Why did he go on the run when he knew that police were looking for him? Do innocent people flee? Okay, let's play a what-if game. 1. What if Chris Jordan had committed this crime with another young black male wearing a white t-shirt and red bandana covering his face? What if Chris Jordan seeing that the heat was on, convinced Liddell King to set up an elaborate plot to frame Julius Jordan. 3. Why would Liddell King agree to that? Did he have the foresight to think, hey, this might get me out of my legal troubles? 4. What if Liddell King had convinced his girlfriend, Vixen McDonald, to say that she saw Julius Jones at King's home on the night of Wednesday, July 28th, soon after the murder of Paul Howell, driving a Suburban, and her testimony was a lie? What if Liddell King then convinced his neighbor, a neighbor in another house, Gordon Owens, to say he was standing outside his house on the night of Wednesday, July 28th, 30 minutes after the murder, and say that Julius Jones was there, and his testimony was a lie? Why would Gordon Scott agree to that? What would be in it for him? 6. What if Annalise Presley is lying when she said that Julius Jones told her he was not at home the night Paul Howell was killed? That's a lot of what ifs that Julius Jones and his defense need to overcome. I'm Paco Rivera. Bye for now.